We're joined by a distinguished panel in the room and online of senior and current and former officials who will help us unpack the challenges we're facing in terms of the aid environment and responses to conflict, and explore what they mean for policymakers and practitioners navigating an increasingly complex landscape. Let me start with the introductions, and I'm going to start with Ms. Tete online. Hannah Tete is the Special Representative for Libya and head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. She's a Ghanaian barrister, diplomat, and politician. She brings decades of experience in addition to her current role at national, regional, and international levels. Prior to her current UNSMIL role, she served as the UN Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. She had been Special Representative of the Secretary General to the African Union and head of the United Nations Office of the African Union. She served as Director General of the United Nations Office in Nairobi. And before joining the United Nations, Ms. Tete was a senior member of the Cabinet of the Government of Ghana and Minister for Foreign Affairs. Dr. Frances Brown is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She has served in 3 U.S. administrations, most recently as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Africa in the Biden administration on the National Security Council. Previously, she'd served as Director for Democracy and Fragile States on the National Security Council under the Obama administration and during the first Trump administration. She's worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development in the Office of Transition Initiatives, managing conflict and transition programs in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. She holds a PhD from Oxford University. Also with us today is Jonathan Marley, a policy analyst on crisis, conflict, and fragility at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He led the most recent 2025 States of Fragility report and oversees associated research and analysis on development, peace, and security. He's previously led the OECD's Building Economic Resilience program in support of the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Before joining the OECD, Jonathan served as the head of office for the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governments, we often know as DCAF, in the Gambia. And most of his career has been in defense, with over 20 years of service as an officer in the Irish Defense Forces, where his appointments included operational tours with NATO, the UN, and EU, and in his final role as director of the Military College. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and his research has broadly focused on the utility of peace instruments in fragile contexts, with an emphasis on peacekeeping, security sector governance, and the security development nexus. So join me in thanking our keynote speakers for joining us today. To open the session, I'm just going to offer a few top lines on some of these, the key issues with respect to international aid. Our discussions over the past 2 days have been framed by this major shift in the international aid environment. It's one of the reasons why we keep coming back to this issue of thinking about our responses in light of the work we all do on transnational conflict dynamics. So this week, the same days as this conference, is the NATO summit. And as the NATO summit is opening, there were major announcements that NATO members are committing to the increase of spending on national security and defense to 5% of GDP. The UK government on Monday highlighted the same commitment and noted its breakdown between 3.5% for core defense and 1.5% for resilience and security, the point that James noted yesterday in our closing discussion. The need to shift spending to defense and security is not just being done by the UK. It was also noted yesterday, and worth repeating here, that 12 of the 14 largest international donors are reducing their foreign aid budgets. To put some concrete numbers on this, and because the U.S. has been the largest international aid donor, and to give us a sense of this kind of reduction, there was a recent, I don't know if you saw this, a recent New York Times article where they actually sort of tried to calculate the level of reduction. They cited from the beginning of the 2025, when U.S. foreign aid was estimated at $120 billion, by May 2025, they had estimated that it had been reduced to $69 billion, with most of the remaining aid in the areas of crisis humanitarian response and global health. We set this against the global challenges and conflict dynamics that we've been talking about over the past day and a half, the complex transnational dimensions of conflict, the reality that all the conflict trackers are showing us that conflict is at a historic high, particularly state-based conflict, and that number from the Institute for Economics and Peace was discussed yesterday, about 92 countries engaged in conflict beyond their own borders. And more broadly, as we discussed in the opening panel yesterday and throughout the day, we talked about the disintegration of the international rules-based order, in which key international players are now relying on coercive means to protect, preserve, and advance their interests. And in this order in which there are more actors, particularly this growing array of middle powers, increasingly engaged in the conflict spaces that we all focus on. So we asked our keynote panelists to share with us considerations for policymakers and practitioners in navigating this resource-constrained, security-focused, and fragmented global environment, and to bring forward for us as researchers and policy actors in the room the implications for international engagement in fragile and conflict-affected environments. What I'd like to do is begin with Jonathan Marley, again, lead author of the 2025 States of Fragility report, to share with us some of the highlights of the report, and then reflect on that and how the OECD is thinking about that programming within the development, peace, and security nexus.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. There will be two parts to my comments. First, very much focused on the report itself, and secondly, a perspective, very much a personal perspective, on what is a very dynamic situation in terms of OECD DAC responses to the challenges that we're seeing. But let me start with how we define fragility. We define fragility as a balance of exposure to risk and the resilience available to mitigate and deal with that risk. And indeed, the methodology behind the fragility framework that we use is pretty much 50-50 risk indicators and resilience indicators. There is a tendency to miss the resilience part of the conversation, but it's very much built in. In our application of that definition, we see fragility as multidimensional. We analyze it across 6 dimensions. We see it importantly as universal. We see it as affecting every community, every state, every system, regardless of where they are in the world. And finally, and perhaps more pertinently, it is incredibly diverse. There was a time 10 years ago where you could readily identify typologies of clusters of fragility. That's getting harder and harder to do. That fragmentation that we hear about so often is becoming more apparent through the application of fragility analysis. With the report we published in February of this year, what we find across the analysis of 177 contexts, including all OECD members, is that we are seeing increasing levels of fragility globally, which will surprise nobody. Interestingly though, 2/3 of OECD members themselves are showing increased fragility. The caveat to that is they also have the most resilience to deal with that fragility, but it's interesting to note that echoing the comments maybe, or aligning with the comments of Professor Khan yesterday, we are seeing the impacts within the Western world and OECD DAC members in particular themselves. However, the disproportionate burden of fragility is in the 61 contexts we identify as experiencing high or extreme fragility, with 18 contexts experiencing extreme fragility. And we refer to contexts because we include territories such as the West Bank and Gaza in our analysis. These 61 contexts account for 1/4 of the world's population, 3/4 of the world's extreme poor, and on current trajectories will account for 92% of the world's extreme poor by 2040. That, of course, is based on data that is 2023, and therefore does not take into account the impact of some of the decisions that have been made in the last 6 months. In terms of the main findings of the application of the analysis for this most recent report, the first thing that stands out to us is the degree to which fragility is being instrumentalized to undermine development gains. This is apparent, and again, very much grounded in a lot of the comments we heard this morning and yesterday, in the selective identification of risks and indeed resilience to target within systems for alternative means. We see this associated with Russian policy across Africa. We also can see it associated with Iran's activity, but interestingly as well, we can see it playing out at a local level. So this is very much not a state-only phenomenon. We also see, as has been mentioned a number of times, record levels of violence of different types, and it is the different types piece that stands out most to us. We are seeing a real diversification of violence, and in looking into that space in a more detailed way, we were struck by the fact that violence seems increasingly to be a preference, not just a reaction to situations that are being encountered. We are seeing that it has a political expediency that is being explored. It has an economic expediency, again, which touches on some of the comments we heard this morning. And also in tandem with that, we see it as a reflection of another major trend, which is the diminishing resilience associated with governance in many of these contexts. So there's a strong correlation there in terms of how actors are thinking about violence and thinking about the advantages of using violence. And often it's because there are very few other options available to either pursue their economic or political goals. Also in that space, again, we hear frequently about the fragmentation and the flux and the disorder. But what was noticeable to us in analysing that space, particularly those 61 contexts again, is how active so many of these contexts were in finding other pathways to the resilience that they desired. So interestingly, we hear a lot about a retreat from multilateral system, but indeed the data we looked at showed an increase in engagement in the multilateral system in these 61 contexts. Also, though, it showed a very significant increase in the willingness to explore with and engage other development offers and other maybe more informal offers in terms of pursuing economic goals in particular. So again, very much consistent with some of the points we heard this morning. The three most dominant trends we saw by dimension that we saw were in the security space, very much touching on those points I've just made, the political space, where we've seen the number of closed autocracies double since 2020, and an associated but not necessarily linked decline in the number of electoral democracies, and also in the economic dimension, where we see a lot of issues that have been standing in these contexts for quite some time beginning to come to the fore in very prescient ways. And re-driving the chronic fragility that we've seen. So this is exposure to debt, exposure to inflation. These contexts collectively account for less than 5% of foreign direct investment. And if you're looking again at those 18 contexts, what we see is that their reliance on external support, official development assistance in particular, is at 66%. So if you think about the levels of the cuts we are hearing about right now, the dependency on that support in those 18 contexts, which are coincidentally those most exposed to conflict, also is significantly deep, and therefore the impact is equally significant. So what we see overall is that the demand for the services and the need for the services that we associate with development and peace activities is increasing significantly, but at the same time we're seeing a retreat from many of the instruments that we use in that space on the part of many actors. And that takes me to the second part of my comments. Overall, the initial set of projections that we looked at in terms of the cuts, bearing in mind 2023 is now our high water mark. That is in terms of record ODA levels, in terms of the kinds of volume going to humanitarian and development, but not peace, which was at a 20-year low. That will now be our future reference point for wherever we are about to go. In terms of what that looks like right now, the initial set of projections we looked at was a fall of ODA of somewhere between 9 and 17%. We will issue a new set of figures in the next few days, which will show actually that 17% is probably in and around maybe, we're maybe going to go slightly higher than that. That is for 2024, 2025. It does not take into account the cuts that are extended over a more extended period of time. Also within that, there are some very real and significant cuts on a sector-by-sector basis, particularly noticeable in health, the further deterioration of funding for peace. And so where dependencies are acute, thinking around areas such as peacekeeping, for example, we're looking at potentially magnitude anything from 30 to 50% in terms of the burden there. And indeed, we can see some of this play out in UN agencies. The 3 points that I would like to kind of present to the room, this is where it's more me than the OECD. First of all is if we look across the foreign policy response to these global challenges, if you're applying the fragility lens, it looks particularly unbalanced right now. Yes, it is being securitized, and there are strong arguments for investing in defense, particularly in Europe. But if you think about the timelines for developing defense capabilities, 10 to 15 years minimum, what happens in between? Also, if you're looking at that much needed defense expenditure and the conversations around it, very much focused on conventional defense and very much can focus on peer adversaries. The kinds of conflicts that we've heard about over the last few days are going to continue, but we're not necessarily looking at what are the instruments we would be using to engage in those conflicts. And this, I think, is where the importance of prevention really comes to the fore. The second point I would say is associated with that is we are now seeing the end of values-led development, cooperation and assistance. And the question, again, I would leave to the room is to what extent can a values-based model emerge in its place? And finally, I think the other thing that's striking about this conversation is that there is a real distinct communications problem around development and peace sectors. The analysis that is produced, as good and as brilliant as it often is, frequently fails to get to the level of decision-making process within national capitals or indeed within multilateral organizations that you would expect or think it deserves to get to. That reflects a number of different issues. I mean, it's noticeable to me how defense actors socialize the political level in terms of their priorities and need. I rarely see that happen in development, humanitarian, or peace space. I think there is a real question around how we think about communication alliances to club together to bring the value of our collective evidence forward so that it does penetrate through to the level where decisions are being making. Were that challenge to be addressed by this room and your network beyond it, then I think that kind of foreign policy imbalance that we're concerned about right now might be redressed. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And in the interest of time, I'm going to come straight to Francis. You're coming from just recently out of your position in the U.S. government and just sort of much experience in terms of how USAID operates and the considerations around aid. Can you do a couple of things, which is one, give us a sense of your observations of the implications of the U.S. cuts on the choices the United States makes, but more generally think about it in the international donor space. Just give us how a policy actor thinks about this based on your recent experience.
Yeah, great. I think a policy actor based on recent experience, as I listen to what Jonathan's laid out, as I listen to the conversations we've had throughout the conference, to my mind, it opens three big open questions that I'm grappling with and that I hope can provoke conversation with all the expertise in the room. So it opens a big question for me on traditional donors' foreign policy trajectories in the coming years, a big question on newer actors or newly prominent actors in the peace and conflict space and how they will shape the landscape, and an open question on the imperative to think of a whole new generation of peace crisis response policies. So I'll come to all those in turn. First, on traditional donors, OECD member countries, I did recently come from the US government, and the trends there, as you've heard, really do mirror the overall trends Jonathan laid out. USAID has been eliminated. The State Department's Conflict and Stabilization Operations Bureau is being eliminated. USIP, the Institute of Peace, is hashing it out in the courts, but is also facing real challenges. So it's a massive contraction of the peace and conflict response capabilities right now. However, and this is my open question to do with the US and other traditional donors, I do wonder if, as you look along the next few years with the current US administration's stated foreign policy priorities, will they not inevitably come back to the need for conflict response and crisis prevention? just taking a few examples of the Trump administration's stated priorities thus far, they've underscored a really economically driven foreign policy focused on opportunities for US businesses. They've specifically looked at signing a big peace deal in the Eastern DRC, Rwanda, Eastern DRC. I think we should look for an announcement this week on that. It's impossible for me to conceive of a peace deal in that area that does not ultimately, if it is to stick, have to grapple with issues of inclusion, accountability, peace building. Even if you're solely looking at it from an economic prioritization, I think ultimately there will be a need for capability and expertise on the conflict side. Another example, the Trump administration has laid out a new commercial diplomacy strategy for Africa. It's said that its engagements with Africa will really be led by this economically driven, business-driven imperative. The senior bureau official for Africa was recently in Cote d'Ivoire talking about this and talking about all the opportunities, particularly in West Africa. I think many in this room will know that if you are looking for economic opportunities in coastal West Africa, inevitably that is shaped by conflicts in the borderlands to the north and the Sahel. You cannot separate those two imperatives, so I think we may come back to that. And then the third example I can think of is Secretary of State Rubio, also National Security Advisor Rubio, also temporary USAID head Rubio, has continually mentioned Syria as a big opportunity for the Trump administration, for geopolitical reasons, for regional security reasons, for counterterrorism objectives. If they are interested in Syria for those reasons, there will be a need to bring on board conflict and inclusion and governance related expertise ultimately. So I believe personally that the pendulum will likely swing back at some point. It may not look the same at all as previous US government architectures. That expertise may end up being embedded more in regional bureaus, for example, in the US system. I know other countries' systems less well, but I do wonder if it is slightly generalizable to other OECD member countries as well, that even as other foreign policy priorities come to the fore, there will be a need for conflict and crisis response capabilities. So welcome the group's thoughts on that. So the second open question that I'm really grappling with is on newer actors in the peace and conflict space or newly prominent actors. In many cases, these actors have been around for a while, but we're seeing them be increasingly salient. So the UAE has come up a lot over this conference for understandable reasons. It is the biggest investor in Africa currently, with massive implications for politics and conflict on the continent. Qatar has been mediating deals in interesting ways, most recently as an observer on the DRC deal that I mentioned, also Israel-Hamas, US-Iran. So Qatar is playing a new conflict mediation role. You've got Turkey, which has played a mediation role in particular conflicts as well. So all of this is changing the landscape. I think none of us from Western donor countries would argue that we have the monopoly or all the expertise on peacemaking. So in general, I think we can see this as a positive development, but it will bring new complexities and new imperatives to the fore, to say the least. It's not just middle powers in Africa. I'd also point to other newly relevant actors. We heard this morning about subnational governors and state governors in the Lake Chad Basin Commission and how they're playing a role there. So I think we're seeing subnational diplomacy in general as a really important trend globally, and that is going to change the peace and conflict space as well. In addition, since a lot of these peace and conflict imperatives, at least particularly from the US side, intersect with commercial and economic needs, we're increasingly, particularly in the US system, seeing the increased relevance of economic actors. So the US Department of Commerce is very relevant on critical minerals, which intersects with these issues. The US Trade and Development Agency, the US Development Finance Corporation, these are actors that we're often not used to talking about in circles like these and when we think of peace and conflict actors, but they have an increasingly important role to play. And for all of this, I think it sort of demands that we think about how we incorporate that into our thinking of peace and conflict. It is no longer the case in the US that the State Department is the first among equals on diplomatic relevance. These economic actors play a real role. And then finally, when it comes to other newer actors or newly prominent actors, obviously there's many philanthropies who are now thinking about how they can or should step in as aid cuts go underway. Private sector actors clearly have a vested interest in peace and conflict in many of these areas. So I think we're seeing a new proliferation of actors, or a new emergence of actors that has really changed the landscape in important ways. So then my third open question is really about thinking about the newest generation of peace and conflict policy responses. So putting these two trends that I laid out together, what traditional donors are doing now, what they may do in the future, plus the emergence of newer actors. Do we need to challenge all of ourselves to think of this as a wholly new generation of crisis response policy? I think the answer is yes. So I recently, for a project, had cause to revisit some of the really seminal works on the first or earlier generations of peace operations, state building, peace building. So works from, that are probably known to many of you, from Roland Paris and Timothy Sisk and the late Chuck Call, looking at some of those volumes that really charted the 1990s and early 2000s and the dilemmas that the international community faced during those generations of peace operations. And I thought the chapter titles were really telling because they could be written today as well. So just a couple examples. Understanding the donor coordination problem. Dilemmas of promoting local ownership. Trajectories of accumulation in war and peace. Making peacemakers out of spoilers. So the list goes on and on. The challenges of yesterday are still our challenges today. Since that time, there's been a lot of learning. There's been a lot of expertise accumulated. I think there's been a lot of lessons gleaned. I credit a lot of individuals in this room, institutions represented here, FCDO support for much of that learning. So we have come a long way since that. But these same challenges remain and are now grafted onto this incredibly challenging landscape that Jonathan laid out. So newer challenges having to do with climate, having to do with technological disruption. Drones are something we did not foresee in 2007 when these books were penned. Geopolitical fragmentation has been discussed. So all the old challenges plus all these new challenges. And it just makes me wonder, as we think about the way ahead, do we need to think about this as a new generation of policy responses and attack that with all of the energy and innovation and good faith that these earlier generations did and try to move forward?
Thank you so much, Frances. Hannah, we're quite privileged to have you join us from the field and to sort of offer the perspective of someone who is really working at the moment to advance stabilization in Libya and to bring to the table your experience in Libya, your recent prior experience in Sudan, and to just give us the perspective from the United Nations, from your role as an envoy, about some of the challenges and constraints that have been raised in this discussion so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of your guests who are listening to this conversation, and I do hope that you can hear me. I think it's absolutely great. I think it's important for us not to make what I would consider fatal assumption that we're going to be successful in doing less with less. It means that effectively we are going to be doing less, and our responses to peace building, to conflict resolution, to addressing the challenges of fragility are going to be inadequate. And so we'll be making choices as to which of these areas perhaps require our attention most. And that will be based on member states, nation states, individual interests. And that means that there will probably be a number of conflict contexts where the conflicts will be unaddressed because they don't happen to be on anybody's priority list. And so that portends, I think, for a more dangerous world. But if I just take it from the UN's perspective, I must also start not just by talking about aid, but also talking about contributions to the UN's regular budget. Now, this year we are seeing we're seeing the US withdraw its contributions to the UN regular budget, which means that we're going to have about 20% less finances than we used to have previously. What that means is that we're not going to have to just cut our budgets, but we're going to lose experienced personnel who have acquired expertise over the years in sometimes very difficult contested settings And it's not clear how we're going to be able to replace them immediately, or for that matter, younger colleagues who are building up their capacity, who are getting to know about these contexts, will not have the opportunity, perhaps under the framework of the UN, to be able to continue down these particular career paths. And I think that the loss of human resource capacity in the individual mission settings is going to pose a significant challenge to all of the countries that invariably will be impacted by the outcomes of the non-resolution of these particular conflict situations. I also would, aside of referring to the regular budget, now also refer to the voluntary contributions, which normally come within the context of aid and development financing. What we're seeing in this context is that since last year, there has been a significant reduction in voluntary contributions. Now, if you look at it within the context of countries where there is ongoing conflict and where we see that it's significantly impacting civilians, for instance, in the situation of Sudan, it means that colleagues from organizations such as OCHA have to make the decisions as to who they are going to support and who they are not going to support, knowing very well that those communities that they don't support are going to be at very serious peril, and that it is unlikely that there will be any other organization coming in to replace what has been lost as a result of the lack of presence of international partners in those settings. I also think it's important to remember that in the African context, with the exception of the DRC, most conflict is intrastate and not interstate. And so what you're seeing is fragile contexts where if we are unable to perform our roles and we see increasing fraying of the peace, development, humanitarian nexus, we are not only creating more fragile states, we are actually exacerbating the conflict. And there will be consequences for other countries, even if they are not directly impacted by those particular conflict contexts. So this is the new world that we find ourselves in, and this is going to be our new normal. How does that impact in terms of who will fill the space that the UN would be leaving behind? Well, that's where we see the engagement now of more bilateral partners, understanding that those bilateral engagements are going to be interest-based, could be transactional, and could also focus on what is in the best interest of the partners that are engaging in these peace processes, which ultimately would have the objectives of pursuing their own national priorities. And in situations where we have countries which have strong commodity production, also impact access to those commodities. Now, if I look at the context of where I am at the moment, Libya, we have a divided country. We have different international interests and different countries that exert influence on the government in Tripoli and the government in Tobruk. In a situation where the UN is unable to engage as effectively as we would like to, with both Tripoli and Tobruk, to be able to bring them together, develop a political roadmap on the way forward, probably we might find ourselves, if we don't work extra hard and we don't have a coalition of international partners supporting us, with a more fragmented context and even perhaps a divided country. Of course, UNSMIL is doing everything possible to avoid that. And we are in the process of trying to develop a new political roadmap so that that would not happen. But if we look at the context of Sudan, where UNITAMS had to fold up because the then government of mainly led by the South refused to accept the UN's engagement, especially after conflict resumed. What we have now is a much more reduced capacity. We have a country team. We also have a special envoy. The key mediation efforts are led by the African Union and IGAD, but where the UN is replaced by sub-regional actors, especially sub-regional actors on the African continent, they have neither the UN's resources in terms of financial resources or capacity to be able to fill that gap. So they can play an important role in helping to get to a peace agreement, as happened within the context of northern Ethiopia in 2022, where you had the African Union working with IGAD, the United Nations, the United States of America, and all of this process of negotiation facilitated by the government of South Africa that brought an end to the Tigray conflict. But the follow-on, investing in peace building, investing in renewing governance structures, helping to rebuild state capacities will be significantly missing because those capacities are usually brought to bear by the UN missions, agencies, funds, and programs. So where does that leave us at the moment? I think we will find ourselves in a situation where these conflict contests become more and more challenged, and we don't see an end to the conflict. On the contrary, based on the interests of other actors, we might actually see that the divisions are further exacerbated. And I think that puts us in a very dangerous place. So what will happen? It means that further down the line, countries that will be impacted by the consequences will have to re-engage perhaps even more expensively to try to manage the impact of the conflict on their national contexts. And when I think of Libya, I'm thinking about the countries of the European Union that are just across the Mediterranean and are likely going to be impacted both by the impacts of international organized crime and international illegal migration. It's important that we don't see alternative peace architectures necessarily as threats, because they are not, if we are able to engage within the context of complementarity and subsidiarity. But it needs cohesion and it needs coordination. And so far, that has not been as present as we would have wished. And so it is my hope that in this dangerous new world, we're very much aware of the risks that we have brought about by the funding choices we have made, and yet we'll still find more productive ways of engaging so that the scenario that I've just painted is not likely to occur. Thank you very much.